Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into an English learning podcast called Podcast Speak English.
I love that podcast. It's so fun and casual. It's great for picking up new vocab and grammar.
Exactly. It's like we're eavesdropping on an English class.
I like that analogy.
So, are you ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so the podcast focuses on sailing and swimming this time.
Right. And right off the bat, they hit us with some great vocabulary.
Like sailing and anchor.
Yes. Classic nautical terms.
It's essential for anyone who dreams of being out on the open water.
Absolutely. And speaking of anchor, the podcast hosts point out that it's not pronounced anchor, it's anchor. A subtle but important distinction.
I've definitely heard people mispronounce that one.
Oh, yeah, it's a common mistake.
But hey, that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To learn and improve.
Exactly. Now let's move on to the dialogue section of the podcast. This one is particularly entertaining.
Two friends are out sailing, decide to go for a swim, and things get a little interesting.
Yeah, you could say that. I don't want to spoil it too much, but let's just say there's a near shark encounter.
Oh, come on. You have to give us a little more than this.
Okay. One of the friends decides to jump in for a swim.
Sounds refreshing.
It does, until his friend shouts that he sees a shark.
Oh, no. So what happens?
Well, I guess you'll have to listen to find out. But I will say that the dialogue highlights some interesting swimming vocabulary.
Like different swimming strokes.
Exactly. They talk about the doggy paddle, the breaststroke, and the backstroke.
I wonder which one they used to escape the shark.
Maybe all three. What I found fascinating was how the podcast hosts explained each stroke so vividly.
Right, like you could actually picture someone doing the doggy paddle, all frantic splashing.
Exactly, or the graceful movements of the breaststroke.
Oh, and the serenity of the backstroke.
It's amazing how much we can convey through our movements, even in the water.
It's like body language, but for swimming. So, do you have a favorite stroke?
You know, I've always been partial to the breaststroke. It feels so powerful, propelling yourself through the water.
I can see that. I'm more of a backstroke kind of person myself.
Yeah.
Just floating along, gazing up at the sky.
Yeah,
Pure relaxation.
both great choices. Anyway, back to the dialogue. I noticed they use the phrase take a dip when they were talking about going for a swim.
Take a dip, yeah. It's such a casual, refreshing way to say go swimming.
It definitely evokes a sense of fun and spontaneity.
Makes me want to take a dip right now.
Me too. And right after take a dip, they use another great phrase. For a little while. They were talking about anchoring the boat for a little while before going for a swim.
For a little while. Yeah. That's one of those phrases that can be used in so many different situations. It's like a wild card.
Totally. It just means for a short period of time, but it's so much more natural than saying that.
Right, like, I'm just going to close my eyes for a little while. Or, let's chat for a little while.
Exactly. It's a great way to sound more fluent and natural in English.
I'm going to try to use that more often. And, another phrase that caught my ear was straight towards.
Ah, yes. Remember how they used it to describe the shark heading straight towards the swimmer?
It just added this sense of urgency and danger.
It did. Straight implies a direct path, no hesitation. And towards, well, it points to the target, the destination.
So together they create this feeling of unwavering movement, like the shark is locked onto its target.
Exactly. It makes it sound pretty scary, right? But thankfully, in this dialogue, the shark situation is purely hypothetical.
Oh, thank goodness. Now, speaking of real-life situations, do you remember how at the end of this episode, the podcast hosts asked for listener stories?
Yeah. They wanted to hear about listeners' own swimming, boating, or even just near-miss adventures.
Well, get this. Our expert has a story that's about to blow you out of the water.
Oh, no. You're not going to bring up that time with my grandfather, are you?
Of course I am. Think darkness, a collision, a capsized boat.
Okay, I get it. You want to hear the story. Fine, but you have to promise not to laugh too hard.
I can't promise anything. But all right, tell us, what happened?
So every summer, our family would go to this lake.
Sounds lovely.
It was. We had a small house on a tiny island. And to make things even better, my cousins had a house on another island nearby.
Wait, you had your own little island archipelago? How cool is that?
It was amazing. We'd go back and forth between the islands for dinners and stuff.
Sounds idyllic.
Yeah.
So what's the story?
Well, one evening, everyone was at my cousin's place for dinner except for my grandfather.
Okay.
It was getting late, so he decided to head back to our island to pick up my grandmother.
Makes sense.
So he hops into the boat, but it's pitch black out there.
Uh-oh, I can already sense trouble brewing.
And to make matters worse, he forgot to turn on the boat's lights.
Oh, no.
So there he is, in the dark, heading straight towards our island, when suddenly,
Don't leave us hanging.
bam! He collides head-on with another boat.
What? Was it your cousin in the other boat?
Yep. My cousin was coming back from the mainland.
Oh my gosh, talk about a family reunion gone wrong.
It was pretty crazy. The impact flipped my grandfather's boat completely over, sending him tumbling into the water.
Oh no. Was he okay?
Thankfully, yes. He was a bit shaken up, but no serious injuries.
That's a relief. What about the boat?
Well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. And to top it all off, the engine had sunk to the bottom of the lake.
You're kidding.
Nope. So we had to call in some scuba divers the next day to retrieve the engine.
Wow. So you had a sunken engine, scuba divers. Sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It was quite the spectacle.
Yeah.
And of course, my grandfather, being a typical grandfather, was more worried about the boat than himself.
I can just imagine. Don't worry about me, just save the boat.
Exactly. So yeah, it's a story that's become a bit of a legend in our family.
I bet. It's a good reminder that even the most peaceful family gatherings can take an unexpected turn.
Definitely. And it also reminded me of how the podcast encouraged listeners to share their own stories.
Absolutely. So listeners, what about you? What's your most memorable experience related to water? Have you ever had a close encounter with a creature of the deep?
Or maybe a boating trip gone awry.
We'd love to hear all about it.
We want to hear about all those crazy water adventures.
While you're thinking about those, let's get back to the podcast. They had some really interesting points about sailing.
Yeah, like they emphasize that it's all about using the wind to power the boat.
No engine.
Nope, just the wind. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Harnessing the power of nature to move across the water.
It's definitely a unique way to travel. What else did they talk about?
They also talked about the importance of anchoring, to keep the boat from drifting away.
Right, anchoring. And that reminds me, we talked about the pronunciation earlier. It's anchor, not anchor.
Yep. It's easy to mispronounce.
It is. Okay, so remember that dialogue where the two friends went for a swim? They used a phrase that I thought was really useful.
Which one? Take a dip.
No, the one after that. For a little while.
Oh yeah, for a little while. It's such a handy phrase. You can use it in so many situations.
Exactly. Like instead of saying, I'm going to rest for a short period of time, you can just say, I'm going to rest for a little while.
So much more natural.
Right. And they also talked about all those different swimming strokes.
Yeah, the doggy paddle, the breaststroke, and the backstroke.
Instead of just saying swim, you can be more specific and say, I'm doing the backstroke.
Exactly. It adds more detail and makes your English sound more interesting. Speaking of interesting, I have to admit something. When they were talking about the doggy paddle, I couldn't help but picture a dog swimming.
Oh, with a little life vest on.
Yes. I know it's silly, but that's what popped into my head.
I get it. Words can definitely conjure up some funny images. And speaking of images, remember how they described the shark heading straight towards the swimmer?
Yeah, it definitely made the situation seem more intense.
Straight implies a direct path, like there's no escape.
And towards indicates the target, the destination.
So when you put them together, it's like the shark is laser focused on the swimmer.
Pretty scary. Luckily, it was all just part of the dialogue. No real sharks were involved.
Thank goodness for that. Now, earlier you told us that amazing story about your grandfather's boating mishap.
Oh, boy.
I'm curious, have you ever had any personal experiences with swimming or boating? Or maybe even a close encounter with an aquatic creature?
Well, my stories aren't quite as dramatic as my grandfather's, but I do have fond memories of swimming in a lake near our summer cottage as a kid. I used to spend hours just splashing around trying to catch frogs and minnows.
Oh, that sounds so peaceful and carefree.
It was pure summertime bliss. And it reminds me of how the podcast encouraged their listeners to share their own stories about swimming, boating, or even near-miss adventures.
Oh, right. They said they wanted to hear about any shark attacks.
Hopefully those are few and far between.
I agree. But I love that they're encouraging their listeners to participate and share their experiences.
It's a great way to build confidence and fluency. After all, language is all about connecting with others and sharing stories.
Well said. So listeners, what's your most memorable experience related to water? Have you ever had a close call with a creature from the deep?
Or maybe a hilarious boating trip gone wrong.
We want to hear it all.
And while you're thinking about your aquatic adventures, we're going to dive back into the podcast. They covered so much in this episode.
It was packed with information, but it was all presented in such a fun and engaging way.
Exactly. It's a great example of how you can learn English without it feeling like a chore.
Learning a language should be a journey, not a destination.
Well said. There's always something new to discover, and every experience, big or small, can help you grow as a language learner. And speaking of journeys, I thought it was great how the podcast ended with a nice little vocabulary review.
Oh yeah, they went back over all the key words and phrases.
Yep. From sailing to anchor to swimming costume, which I thought was interesting because that's the British English term for swimsuit.
It is. I love how English has all these regional variations. It makes it even more fascinating to learn.
Me too. And they even included some fun words like tan, dive, and towel.
It's like they were creating a whole sensory experience of a day at the beach.
Totally. And not only did they list the words, but they also gave clear definitions and example sentences.
Yeah, it was a great way to reinforce the learning.
And I loved how they even revisited the pronunciation of anchor one
Uh,
last time just to make sure everyone got it.
Anchor, not anchor. Got it.
Exactly. And they also used those example sentences to show how versatile phrases like for a little while and straight towards can be,
Right. Like you could say, I'm going to read for a little while.
or the ball is coming straight towards you.
Exactly. Simple phrases, but so useful.
It's all about those little nuances that make your English sound more natural and fluent.
Well said. I think it's safe to say we've done a pretty thorough deep dive into this English learning podcast.
We covered a lot of ground: vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, even storytelling.
It was a whirlwind of linguistic exploration.
And hopefully our listeners are feeling inspired to continue their own language learning adventures.
Absolutely. Remember, every conversation, every new word you learn, every story you share, it all adds up.
And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one sharing your language learning triumphs on a podcast.
Or your crazy boating mishap stories.
Yeah, exactly. Until then, keep diving in, keep exploring, keep those language adventures going.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.